all right. First off, right away we're seeing Cacao. Oh, I did not realize you guys did motion capture.
Yeah, yeah, we especially in this in these trailers for 3K we've like we previs them, which is what you see in the top left there, where they kind of block it out in the motion capture studio. Then we start rigging it together with Sam there playing your own show.
So is this performance capture? Are these also the voice actors for the game?
No.
Okay.
Those guys are just kind of blocking it out so that they can turn it back like this is what we want, and then we use the in-game models. So like, and then the animators do specific little bits and pieces. Like if you like when he points his finger, that kind of stuff is created bespoke. But we don't use the voice actors to like act out the scenes.
Was this the first time you guys had done like a mocap for a Total War game specifically?
No. We've done mocap for loads of them probably since before I was here for sure. So like a decade's worth of mocap probably. We have our own studio just down the road that we do our own motion capture in.
But this is like the first time you guys had like one-on-one, like these big epic duels, basically, right? Like where it's like
the biggest time, like the biggest and the most effort we put into like the one-on-one match combat. But we have had match combat in previous Total War titles, but it's really sort of brought out in Three Kingdoms more because you get like the duel system where you see them fighting each other with like the wuxia sort of martial arts, which is much more pronounced, and we focused on it much more than previous titles.
Can you guys talk about some of the like history, like because you guys are known for like you try to be as historically accurate in most of your games in terms of like units and stuff like that. And...
Sure. When it comes to stuff like units, we have two primary sources that we use for the game. We use the records of the Three Kingdoms, which was written at the time, and that's like the official Imperial archive of all of the information of the Han era. And then we have the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is written about 1,000 or so years later, which is a sort of a fictionalized, semi-fictionalized romantic take on sort of the drama of the period. And for units and stuff, the record is very useful because it tells us a lot about unit sizes, army sizes, who had what and where, and even like the details of like food amounts and siege length and all that kind of stuff. But one thing that we noticed when it comes to Three Kingdoms is that a lot of the armies are very much just sort of conscripts and peasants and people who had horses were the wealthy, and people who were just poor were given a stick and a spear and said go in that way, point and kill essentially. So we used some of the elements from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms to sort of bolster out our unit roster a little bit. Stuff like Gongsun Sons, White Horse Fellows, or Cao Cao's cavalry is all mentioned in the Romance, but it's a little bit dubious. It's not like completely false, but it's like we got it from Romance because it adds flavor and texture to the sort of the depth of the unit roster. But for everything else, like the buildings and like the reforms, that stuff is all very densely packed into the records of the Three Kingdoms, and so we know almost exactly on a day-to-day level what the Han Dynasty did, how it operated. So that all comes from there, and it's very, very, very fastidiously researched. And we also used our expert Rafe de Crispiny, who is he's like a 7 or 8 doctorates. He's just like the smartest guy, particularly on late Han era China, so he knows his stuff. So we were consulting with him the entire time, saying, Rafe, does this work, does this not work? And he was brutally honest with us and helped us sort of refashion the game to be as historically authentic as we could make it.
You know, you guys have done cinematics before, but this is like, you know, the Three Kingdoms is a pretty cohesive story. Like, did you guys have to approach things differently to kind of tell this tale? Because, you know, Total War is always, it's very open-ended in the way things can go.
I think in a lot of ways, the Three Kingdoms period is, you're right, it's very different from previous Total War titles, even the ones that are more character-focused, because something like Napoleon or Attila focuses on one man and their conquest through history. So Napoleon does all of this, or Attila does all of this, whereas in Three Kingdoms, you can see just from the 3 bits of trailers you've got there, is that there is a huge cast of characters who are all vitally important to the plot. So it's like, it's not the story of Liu Bei, it's not the story of Cao Cao, it's not the story of Dong Zhuo, it's all of their stories. And I think that gives us a really cool place to start the sandbox game, because each of these characters is equally important at the beginning of the game, and each of them has a really interesting story that could be told. It's not just us retelling the story of the Three Kingdoms, it's giving the players sort of one of several points of these characters where they can go, it's feasible that this character can go all the way to being emperor. It's feasible that this character can go all the way to being emperor. So for us, it's whilst we have this rich tapestry of history to work with, it's also really liberating for us to think this works best for us as a sandbox as well.
Just kind of piggybacking off of that, the sandbox discussion, a game that had 3 protagonists in the sandbox was Grand Theft Auto 5. And I know it's a very different game than the Total War series, but did you look to games like that for any kind of idea for how the narrative could flow when you have these like 3 different characters that you could drive narrative around?
I'd say the closest thing that would link to it would be maybe Lobe and his 3 brothers, because like obviously Grand Theft Auto 5 shifts between characters as part of a linear narrative, like you said, is very different. Whereas in this, I don't know, they're all telling their individual tales rather than sort of coming together into a cohesive whole, which is what something like Grand Theft Auto 5 does. So this is just about, I think, carving history with your character. Although as the game goes on, you may end up with some of your enemies becoming your friends, even becoming your generals. But I don't think we looked to stuff like that. I don't really think we saw them interlocking in a way that could be really helpful to making the game.
Can you guys talk about? I know you said. I think you mentioned this was a different team that did this from like the Total War Warhammer games. But what have you guys learned from past Total War franchises that you applied and like improved upon in Three Kingdoms?
I think every time we make another Total War game, we look at past Total War games and see what worked well and what perhaps didn't work as well, and how we can iterate and that kind of stuff. And so the Warhammer guys are off doing some really cool things, have done really cool things. And obviously in Three Kingdoms we have this like hero system, which is where we're making, especially in romance mode, where the characters are much larger than life. They can do really sort of death-defying, almost supernatural acts. And obviously, certainly you can see how that might be inspired by the lords that we have in Warhammer, but maybe tweaked slightly to be more appropriate to our setting. So they're not like demigods; they're just more like super powerful humans. And then Thrones of Britannia, that came out a little while ago. It had essentially the beginnings of our retinue system, or our mustering system, where you recruit a unit, and then you don't immediately get it straight away. You have to wait a few turns for it to develop strength as you continue to draw in people from around you. So we're always looking at what works from other Total War titles and how we can build forward from that.
Nice. Now you mentioned the hero system, and you have a lot of, all of these characters have relationships with each other that will affect how they interact positively or negatively. How do you go about just sort of designing that web of lines that connect all these characters together and affect all these different relationships?
Well, at the beginning of any campaign, we sort of have a setup of how people feel towards one another based on the history that we know. So most people will dislike Dong Zhuo, most people won't trust Lu Bu, and that kind of thing. The 3 brothers are really formed together. But once the relationship system is sort of unshackled and let go, it's up to the system's up to the player as well, because you're right, they all interlock, but ultimately it just kind of takes control. Like you have to start managing, the player has to start managing who is friends with one another, who's not friends with one another, moving generals around so that generals who are friends work together, and giving them administrative positions so that they stay satisfied, because it's as much about their satisfaction within your faction as it is with one another. I had an interesting situation about a few months back where I defeated Dong Zhuo's faction as Liu Bei, and then about 10 or 15 turns later, Dong Zhuo, who had somehow managed to survive the purge of his faction, ended up in my character pool. Like I could recruit him, so I was like, sure, I'll recruit Dong Zhuo. There he is. I bring him into my faction. Immediately, 2 things: nobody likes him, and he demands a really high position in my government because he's Dong Zhuo. So I give him a decent position, but essentially he goes around the world on his own because nobody likes him, and that's just something you have to deal with, if you see what I mean. So the systems will flow and ebb as the game progresses, and it's up to the player to sort of manage how people get along. It's a bit like a simulation as well, like playing The Sims.
Can you guys talk about the Total War series? Obviously, it's very popular, but what do you guys do for like newcomers to the series? Because it's not necessarily a game you can just kind of jump in and play. There's a lot of specific mechanics, a lot of rock, paper, scissors, a lot of positioning, stuff that you have to learn. How do you make that approachable for new players to the series in Three Kingdoms?
Well, the first time user experience is something that we've looked at quite heavily in Three Kingdoms because, obviously, like you say, they're really big beasts, a Total War game. There's no denying it. They have a lot of moving parts. But the key is sort of introduce the player to these parts gradually rather than just dropping them into like a vast ocean and saying, okay, now swim. So in the first few turns, the player will be introduced to attacking, defending, taking settlements, managing settlements, the basic bare bone structure. And then as time goes on, it'll be like, here's some new features like assignments, here's like maybe take a look at diplomacy, here's your reform tree. Some things are blocked off until you get to a certain point of strength. And then as well as that, in terms of like mass information that a player can digest, we have our help mode system. So if you tap F1 at any point over any UI screen, like an overlay will come up telling you what everything means, what everything does, and break down all the game systems for you, which is a bit more dense in terms of like pure text and pure information. But once the player has got to grips with the initial sort of challenge of their campaign, they can refer back to this sheet at any point, even in battle or in campaign, and find out what something means, what it is to them, how they can benefit from it, and hopefully make the game more manageable.
One of the reasons that I'm familiar with the Three Kingdoms and all the characters in this game already is because of the Dynasty Warriors series and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms series as well. I know we'd already brought up Grand Theft Auto, but as far as reference material goes, like, since there are a few games out there that have already done historical research, were those influential to you at all? I know Dynasty Warriors is a lot more over the top, definitely a different genre of game, but
I think all of the Three Kingdoms media is something that we've looked at. So we looked at movies like Red Cliff, we looked at the TV series, both the one in the 80s and the one that's a bit more recent, as a reference point for how to treat the subject matter and how we can adapt it. Dynasty Warriors was certainly something that we looked at in terms of how these characters are represented, but like you said, it's a bit hyperbolic, it's a bit exaggerated, a bit extreme, so we kind of peeled back from that a little bit, and we don't reference it as much. Like the fact that these characters can wade into battle and turn the tide by mowing down dozens of men is something that certainly you will see in romance mode, and that's sort of a Dynasty Warriors feeling. Unfortunately, we didn't get the really rocking guitar soundtrack from Dynasty Warriors, but yeah, I think we take a little bit of everything. So like the Cao Cao you see here, for instance, he is not exactly modeled, but if we're going to take someone who looks most like the character from Red Cliff, for instance, because that's the one that's most made an impression with us. So yeah, we just take bits and pieces here and sort of fashion what we think is the most authentic version of Three Kingdoms.
I have a question about the engine and just kind of how you folks implement your game design. When I think Total War, I think tons of characters on screen.
Yeah.
So when you're in the labs messing around, like, how do you have you hit a limit, and how do you balance just hitting a superlative for superlative's sake versus the game still being fun and manageable when it comes to just the players on screen?
In terms of what can the engine do, that is a question like way above my pay grade. I'm like not technically minded enough to tell you the answer to that question. But in terms of like how do you make it manageable, it's just a constant balancing process with people who are again more into the nuts and bolts of the systems than I am. So like for instance, we recently we kind of revealed extreme unit sizes, and that required us to think, okay, how will that affect gameplay? How do we tweak an extreme unit size so it doesn't end up being a squelch of essentially a battle that has no tactics? It just has like a Zerg rush. And these are sort of fine-tuning things that go on all of the time. But in terms of the engine, yeah, that's unfortunately not my question to answer.
Oh no, that's fine. I think you answered my question. Just kind of the challenge of balancing, just putting a ton of enemies on screen versus it being manageable and fun.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, something like if you look at previous Total War titles like Napoleon, and like the amount of people in the Battle of Waterloo is not the amount of people that we represent, because it's just it's unrealistic, especially for that point in time. So who knows what we might be in 10 years? Maybe it'll be 1-to-1.
When you guys are discussing, the next Total War franchise or game, how do you go about deciding what era to do, what genre to tackle? Is it like a vote system? Is it something you guys have already had planned before the game even begins, or how to talk about that process a little bit?
The deciding on which era we go next is like a really high level thing, but we look at a lot of stuff like what the players want and also what we internally want to do as well. So for Three Kingdoms, for instance, we've heard from the community for a long time they wanted us to tackle the Three Kingdoms period. We have a lot of people who are on the Three Kingdoms design team now as well who really love the Three Kingdoms period. and the media. Like they play a ton of Dynasty Warriors, they play a ton of the Koei games, watch the movies, seen the TV series, and so they're like, can we do it? They're rallying for it, and then so we think, yeah, now is the good time for us to do that. But as for how another era is decided, it's a similar process. We look at what people want, and we look at what we want to do as well. And particularly if it's an interesting time period, and if it fits all of the criteria of what makes a good Total War game. So again, if we use Three Kingdoms as an example, has a really interesting and diverse cast of characters, which is the main reason we wanted to push that character system in our game. It is a massive, bloody conflict, like 30, 40 million people died in it, so it's perfect for a Total War game. And then China is like a huge country, perfect for conquering, and also not somewhere we've been before, so it is different. So it kind of ticks all the boxes. And every time we look at somewhere else and we think of the gameplay, like the design choices that we want to push forward, we think what era of history matches that the best.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about China itself. And like this era. So when you're researching, getting all the details, did you guys get a chance to go to China and check out where some of these historical battles took place for reference, or have you had a chance to study any armor or weaponry?
To go and study like stuff that's been there was an exhibition, at least when we started developing the game, in the Imperial War Museum or in one of the museums in London, and there's a bunch of stuff around. But as far as I'm aware, no one's been to China. I didn't go to China. I wish I'd gone to China at the beginning. But no, we mostly rely on what we can access relatively easily. So museums, primary and secondary resources, using people like Rafe, who are like experts in their field and that kind of stuff, sort of paint ourselves a picture. I know back in Shogun, some people went to Japan, but I think they went on their own because they wanted to go. So yeah, I would have loved to have gone to China, but it didn't happen.
Okay. Was there anything that you learned in the process of doing research for the game that made you have to pivot as far as design choices, or maybe like some mechanics or things like that?
Nothing's jumping out at me because it's been quite a long time after the game's been going on now. I've probably forgotten half of it, but nothing's jumping out at me at the minute of us having to sort of drastically adapt what we were doing. But there is a lot of situations where we sent on a lesser scale, like if we sent a list of buildings or sent a list of units to Rafe and said, hey, can you check this over for us? Or we want to make our hierarchy system work like this. What do you think? And he sent it back saying, like, I see what you're trying to do, but it just didn't work like that. So you might have to do it this way instead. I think the hierarchy system is probably one of the better examples of that, where you advance through from Marquis to Duke to King to Emperor. And ultimately he was like, it didn't quite work like that, but you could probably, it would probably work if you did it this way instead. And we were like, okay, Rafe, thank you for saving us from ourselves. And that was sort of a constant sort of iterative process with him. But nothing drastic, like we didn't suddenly realize that all horses in China have 5 legs and therefore we have to remodel the entire game or anything like that.
I have a question. Which mode do you anticipate your core audience playing more of, romance or records?
Our core audience? Oh man. I would say probably more people will play romance mode. But records mode is a very clean sort of Total War sort of classic mode, if you will. So maybe the hardcore of our players will jump into that if they want they're more historical, and if they feel like maybe there's a bit too much of a Warhammer influence in romance, which I don't think is true, but if they see it a little bit, they don't want these superpowered heroes, then they can go back to romance mode, because ultimately these two modes aren't that different. It's the same game, just with some slight tweaks to how the heroes work, and maybe 1 or 2 events and dilemmas don't trigger because they were based on the fictional account. So I would say more people will play romance, but maybe you might be right, the hardcore might start tilting towards records a bit more.
Great.
When you guys are making these, I mean, Total War has its roots in PC. I mean, that's usually the RTS. That's where they live. But does the conversation ever come up of porting one of your games to console, especially with like for example, Nintendo Switch has touchscreen support and hand controls, and you could probably use both to implement some of the controls. Does that come up in the office at all when you're in the design phase, or it's just PC only?
kind of conversations that we have kind of casually, like, oh, how would we put this on a console, for instance? And maybe people super high up have had that talk, like just as like speculatively. But as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to bring anything onto a console at this time. So, sorry.
Some consoles are starting to support keyboard and mouse, so I think that there's at least the human interface side is kind of being taken care of. But then again, it's also a very graphically intensive game.
It's a technological question as much as it is like an ergonomic one, yeah, for sure.
So I kind of want to talk about these 3 trailers that we have here, each one representing like a different sort of one of the 3 powers
Sure.
in the 3 kingdoms. So let's start here with Cao Cao. So how do you sort of balance out the characters in a game like this? Because obviously there's sort of the historical personalities that are already there, but you have to be a little more dynamic than that, I'd imagine.
For sure,
creating a robust story,
so
especially one that can pivot.
Yeah, we deal with sort of 2 elements when we look at the character. We look at what we know already, and also we deal with the underpinning of how we define each character. So each character is defined a little bit by the elements of the Wuxing system. So fire, earth, metal, wood, and water, I'm thinking. And so Cao Cao, for instance, is an earth, which he's kind of very considered very smart, very slow, and very like tricky. He can be quite tricky. And so we marry his we know that he's quite cunning, we know that he's intelligent with that, and we were able to build, like you said, like a dynamism around that. So when we get to situations where Cao Cao wasn't, or a situation where like, how would he act? We sort of fall back on, okay, what would he act? How would his element act? How would he act if he's trapped in this situation? Would he fall back? Would he attack? What would he say for dialogue? That kind of stuff. So most of the characters are married against their historical persona and sort of their design underpinning of their element, and then marry those 2 together to find what we like a fully fleshed out character for the game. No, it's like Dongzhou is well, he's a bit more nuanced than people would have him believe, but he is like obviously the bad guy of the story. He seizes control of the emperor, takes control. You can hear in the trailer as well. He's talking about only power yields victory and that kind of stuff, and only strength can rule. Because he's reached essentially the apex. You can see him at the top of the stairs there in the Imperial Palace. He's sort of reached the apex of his power, and he's essentially thinks he's unstoppable because he has Le Bu here as his right hand. So it's not just that he has the Imperial armies, it's also he has this peerless warrior with him as well. So Dongzhou is quite easy to write because we know a lot about him in that he loves warfare, which matches with his element of fire. We know that he's been spurned in previously, like before the game, he was spurned by the Han government for losing a battle against the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And now we know he had a penchant for cruelty and barbarity. So he's pretty easy to just say, yeah, kill, murder, but also focus on how he's getting revenge. He feels like he's justified in doing this because he essentially was put out, he was shamed by the government, and everyone calls him a traitor now, but he's like, no, I'm not a traitor. I saved the Han from itself, and anyone else who is against me is a traitor, but at the same time, he's really just enjoying his revenge, really. So Zheng Zhang is an interesting one in that she's a real character from history, but we know very little about her, and there are some conflicting reports about whether or not she was 1 person or 2, which we kind of used to our advantage, but we also took the liberty in just saying she's 1 person. And she operates sort of asymmetrically with the other characters in the game who are established. They're part of the Imperial government, or they are part of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, or they're just or they are the Imperial government, and they want to either restore or claim the throne for themselves. Zheng Zhang operates on a different sort of spectrum in that she doesn't care about the throne, she doesn't care about dynasty, she doesn't care about empire. She just wants to take what she can for herself, and everything else can burn. And she's sort of very slow and practiced, and she fights more like guerrilla warfare. And you can hear in the trailer where they're talking about it only takes a single cut and the wound will fester all the same. And by the time she's done with you, you will beg for mercy, and death will be like a relief. So we threw her into the game because we thought she was a really interesting character to flesh out like that, and also she provides some counter gameplay to the other normal factions, and just a bit of variety, and also a really interesting, as you can see, like an absolute badass as well. So we thought it'd be really cool to represent her the best way we could.
Nice. Now, obviously, things can go from, you can follow what actually happened historically, but then, you know, things branch out as well. So like the Yellow Turban Army could totally win the battle for the Three Kingdoms and stuff like that. Like, when you have to design cinematic elements around that, like, how do you sort of plan out the course? Like, well, if A had happened this way, that would have led to B, etc.
We sort of build a campaign on moments, like fulcrum points, that are less about what happened if, but more like this has happened. So the event system and the dilemma system sort of help you drive through your campaign with sort of Three Kingdoms inspired and relevant events that are like, okay, this is happening to you now. This might have happened anyway. This might have happened if you were in a situation, even if it didn't actually happen. And then when you build up your prestige enough and you get to a certain point, like the game shifts. So when you get to being a warlord, you get a cutscene that is themed around how the tide of China is turning. The history of the country will be written in blood and you must take your place. So it's less about, oh, you managed that, that's not normal. And then later on you get to the Three Kingdoms and it just talks about how Three Kingdoms have risen and the only one can be the Emperor, and at the end you get your game one, which is very bespoke to each character. So I don't think it's less about, there certainly wasn't a struggle in us replicating a what if situation, because again the sandbox sort of just lets that happen organically. We just like to sort of tell the player at certain points through that campaign how they're progressing and how the balance of the campaign has shifted based on what they've done.
Nice. Was there anything that you guys learned during the process of development that you thought was really interesting and decided to integrate it into the game, either from like a visual or character standpoint or from like a gameplay mechanic standpoint?
Nothing specific is jumping out at me, but I think, again, like I said before, one of the main reasons we took on Three Kingdoms was that we all thought it was a really cool period of time, and there were a lot of really interesting stuff we wanted to show. Like, one of the things that I like the most, and I've had in a lot of conversations and interviews, is that people are saying, oh, you've made China look quite sort of fantastical and sort of romantic. I'm like, dude, that's just how China looks. Like, it's just, we're not used to these gigantic mountains with little like temples sitting in the nooks and crannies and stuff. It's just China as a whole, as a culture at this point in time particularly, was more dramatic and more exaggerated and more crazy than even some of the wilder stuff that was happening in the West at the same time. So I think it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but like all of it, can I say all of it? Because it's just, the whole thing is just wild, and that's what drew us to it in the first place.
I got one more. Was there anything in particular that you wanted, that you put in the game? Like, for example, you guys with the historic, because when you're making a game that's kind of rooted in history, you do want to be historically accurate somewhat, but you also want it to be fun. Like, so if there were only, like you said, if there were only two units you could play as, the stick peasants and the horse cavalry, it wouldn't be very fun. Or if, like, you know, or if this dynasty won, so you'd have to lose these three battles, it wouldn't be very fun. Was there anything that you guys put in the game and then changed later because you're like, this is much more fun if we did it this way?
Well, that's kind of game development in a lot of ways. It's sort of constant iteration and playing it and seeing what you think and then changing it again. With reference to the units, for instance, you get a lot of situations where, like you say, it's people got given a spear and pointed in a direction, and maybe that would just mean that we only had spear units. So we get like tiers of those, like you get spear units with shields, spear units with better shields, spear units on horses, bowmen, and then crossbowmen and that kind of stuff. So we knew what weapons they had, and then we took a little bit of sort of flexing with how we might diversify that, but in a realistic and sort of approachable way, rather than saying this has a spearman and this guy's got a gun. No, but situations we just sort of broaden out where we can without flexing to the unrealistic. What we like to say a lot of the time is that the games are historically authentic because a player can diversify in whatever way they want. So if they want to go down a particular reform or technology tree all the way to the end, for instance, it's like they're just gunning for one certain thing, and they may have got that maybe like 100 years ahead of schedule because of how fast they went down the tree. Like, fine, they can do that. The system allows for it because it's a sandbox. So yeah, like we iterate all the time to sort of get rid of elements that we think are a little bit, they're not working as well. But ultimately, I think we ended up with quite a good thing, like quite an authentic situation. Like, probably the most authentic I've ever seen in Total War game, and they're all quite authentic. So,
I guess the last thing I want to say is, like, when does the game come out?
May 23rd, correct? Yeah. Ben is nodding at me, so that's fine. Yeah, May 23rd. So it's just over a month.
Right around the corner.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Skype.